Game developers are obsessed with the wrong things. They spend months trying to decide which game engine to use, fine-tuning the graphics, and writing the perfect code, only to end up with a game that no one wants to play. Why? Because they forget the one thing that actually makes games fun: game design. You see, unlike movies or music, games are interactive, and that means that if you don't design for the player, it doesn't matter how good everything else is. Let's say that you're making a game, a platformer maybe. So you play a few iconic platformers like Celeste, Super Mario, or Super Meat Boy, because you want to understand the genre a bit better. And what do you notice? You see a few power-ups, a double jump or dash, wall jumps, all those things. And then, without thinking too much about it, you decide to add all those things into your game. Because they're in those games, and those games are successful, so those elements must work, right? But this is exactly where so many developers go wrong. Instead of designing a game, they pick a genre, maybe even a mix of two genres if they are feeling inspired, and then they create a checklist of features that they think they need, like XP systems and turn-based combat for RPGs, coins and enemies that you can jump on for platformers, and modular building and crafting for survival games. The problem here is that more often than not, they don't stop to really understand the purpose of those elements, or if they even had one to begin with. But how can you avoid this? How can you create a game that's actually cohesive, engaging, and memorable? Through game design, of course. And that's what today's video is all about. I will be sharing 9 essential game design principles that will completely change how you make games. And if you want, I've put together a free
cheat sheet.
Sorry, I cannot pronounce that. With these principles. You can find it in my Discord, link in the description. But now let's get straight into it with the first principle. Focusing on a single, strong, and simple main mechanic. Every great game revolves around a core idea. Something simple but powerful that drives everything. For example, think of Portal. The main mechanic is of course the portal gun. That's it. It's a simple idea, but the developers built an entire game around it. 2 actually. They found ways to make the player feel challenged, smart, and powerful by solving puzzles using it. Now, this doesn't mean that the portal is the only mechanic in the game, of course. You're not just sitting in an empty room with 4 walls and the gun. That wouldn't even be a game. But that portal gun is connected to everything else. Or should I say, everything else is connected to the portal gun. Now, this core mechanic doesn't have to be only one action. In a platformer, it could be moving, jumping, and dashing in the case of Celeste, and moving, jumping, and getting upgrades in the case of Super Mario. So, it should be a single mechanic, but not necessarily a single action. Once you pick this core mechanic, that main building block, you can continue with the development. And that brings us to my second core principle of game design. Don't just copy, understand. As I already said in the intro, one of the main problems I see is that people just look at their favorite games and try to copy every mechanic and piece of content they have. And I get it, I also do it. It's absolutely natural to grab inspiration from other games. Sometimes it's even fine to replicate something one for one, but only if you actually understand what you're copying and why it exists in the first place. Let's take platformers as an example again. In Super Mario Bros., you've got coins spread across the map. And so, when working on a platformer, many developers will add coins, placing them here and there. A few to the right, a few to the left, some floating midair. Because why not, right? I mean, Super Mario does it, so why shouldn't you? But the thing is, coins in Mario Bros. Aren't just there for decoration. They serve a really specific purpose. First, yes, they give you bonus points, and collecting 100 grants you an extra life. But more importantly, they guide the player. The placement of coins in Super Mario directs the player's movement and decisions. For example, the coins can lead you to higher platforms or secret areas, showing you where to go without feeling like you're being forced. That's why it's so important to ask yourself, how does this make my game more fun or interesting? Don't include things that will only result in noise, but I will talk about this in detail later. And so, if you're adding coins to your game, use them to guide the player. Don't add coins to the left when the player is supposed to move to the right, because then you're just confusing them and providing no value. And this leads me to the third principle of game design. The best tutorials are invisible. What I mean is that good game design teaches players what they need to know without overwhelming them with text boxes, arrows, or dialogues. The learning should happen organically as they interact with the game world, through level design, the placement of objects, and the challenges they face. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't add a text box or dialogue to introduce a new mechanic, But on top of that, you should also introduce these mechanics naturally, using the environment to teach the player how they should engage with it. For example, let's say that to jump in your game you need to press space, and to move you press A and D. When the game starts, you can show the icons on the screen, like most games do. But then you should force the player to put it into practice. If the player starts here and here's the door, you can add a pit that they have to jump over in order to reach the door. Or, even better, since it's the first time introducing the mechanic, rather than adding a pit that kills them, maybe add a tile blocking the path instead, or a different pit that they can get out of easily. Because remember, reward is generally a better teacher than punishment. By using this kind of invisible tutorials, you end up with the same game, but a very different result. You make the player feel smart, and everyone likes that feeling. So, if you add a wall jump, don't just tell the player that it exists, and then place an extremely difficult section where they need to wall jump 10 times in a row to make it to the end. Instead, create a section at the end or beginning of a new level, where they can discover this mechanic without any type of danger, and then add more difficulty as they get used to it. Not every game should be cozy and easy, but they also shouldn't be unfair, except Dark Souls. And since we don't want to oversaturate our players, remember the fourth principle. Every mechanic should have depth, not complexity. A common mistake is assuming that adding more mechanics automatically makes a game better. But complexity isn't the same as depth. Complexity is just having a lot of mechanics, stats, or systems. Depth, on the other hand, is when a mechanic stays interesting over time, when it gives players room to experiment, improve, and make meaningful decisions. Take chess as an example. It only has a handful of different pieces and really simple rules, but the depth comes from the near infinite strategies that emerge from those simple mechanics. The same goes for the game I'm working on, Rogue Inferno. You can move using WASD, and you can attack using cards. That's it. The combinations of those two elements is enough to provide depth for the players to try different strategies, movements, combos, etc. Wishlist now, by the way, link in the description. And the problem with adding too much complexity connects with the fifth principle, balancing player choice and constraints. Giving players choices is great, but too much freedom can be overwhelming. This is what's known as decision paralysis, when there are so many options that the player doesn't know what to do, and instead of feeling empowered, they feel stuck. It's like walking into a restaurant with a 20-page menu. Sure, having options is nice, but when you spend half an hour just trying to pick something, the experience suffers. And what I end up doing is ordering the same thing every time I go there, because I've got no time to read it all over again and explore new options. The same thing happens in games. If every path is equally viable, every weapon is equally good, and every skill tree seems useful at all times, then nothing feels meaningful. So, for example, instead of having a skill tree with 1,000 different routes, you can have one for each character. Because if you're an assassin, you may want to choose between a dash and invisibility, but you don't want to be reading about better affinity for heavy armor or fire damage or whatever. The sixth principle is that each challenge should teach or test something. Levels, enemies, obstacles, they should all serve a purpose beyond just being difficult. This connects really nicely to the principle about invisible tutorials, but it goes beyond introducing a completely new element or mechanic. Sometimes players already know how to shoot, dodge, block, or whatever your main mechanics are, but there's always room for improvement. So everything you create should add to the learning curve. For example, in Enter the Gungeon, they could have just created 10 enemies, each with twice as much health and damage, and call it a day, because technically that's making the game more difficult, but not in the way you want it to be. Instead, they have enemies with different attack patterns, movement patterns, and speed. That way, the player will sometimes have to focus on dodging, while other times they will need extra accuracy to kill some enemies. And then, at the end of each level, there's a boss that will test those abilities with their changing attack patterns and overall higher difficulty. The seventh principle is that you should treat your game like an ecosystem, a web of elements that influence and interact with each other, creating emergent gameplay. In Nuclear Throne, for example, enemy bullets don't just exist to hurt you. You can destroy them with melee weapons. Explosions chain together, corpses can be thrown, and mutations change the way you interact with the game world entirely. Think about Minecraft too. The world is an ecosystem in itself. The core mechanics like mining, crafting, and building don't just exist separately. They interact with each other in countless ways. For example, mining resources like iron and coal allows you to craft better tools and armor. But you also need food to survive and keep your health up while exploring dangerous areas. The crafting system connects these actions together, and the day-night cycle affects how you play and plan your strategies. And now that you know these 7 principles, you can finally work on your game. And once the foundation is laid, the 8th principle comes into place. Playtest constantly and watch players, don't just listen to them. Players cannot always tell you what's wrong. Often, they may not even know. They may complain about controls being too slow when the actual issue is a lack of feedback when pressing buttons, making them feel disconnected from their actions. That's why it's crucial to pay attention to how they interact with your game, not just what they say. A common situation is when players struggle with a mechanic, but they cannot express what's confusing them. They may say, "I don't like this part," but they cannot tell you why. This is where watching them play becomes invaluable. Maybe the level design is unclear, or the challenge spikes too suddenly. It's also important to remember that not all feedback is good feedback. Sometimes players will have strong opinions about a feature, but those opinions might stem from frustration, confusion, or maybe just because their favorite game does things differently, and not because there's a problem. This is why playtesting should be done frequently and with a variety of players. Each player brings different experiences and skills, and each one will give you a different perspective on what's working and what's not. And now the final principle. Be ready to cut features that don't fit in. If something isn't working, don't force it. And that goes for everything in life. Just because it was part of your plan doesn't mean it will work. The reality is, no matter how much time or effort you put into an idea, if it's not making the game better, it's just slowing you down. Maybe you plan an elaborate crafting system, but in playtesting, players ignore it because it feels unnecessary. Or maybe you wanted a deep morality system, but the rest of the game doesn't support these meaningful choices. So just let it go. The best games feel cohesive because everything in them belongs. So don't be afraid to take a step back, ask if something is actually adding value, and if it's not, cut it. And that's it. Those are my 9 principles to make better games. Oh, you're still here? What, did you think there was going to be a secret 10th principle? Alright, fine, here it is. Don't make online games. Trust me, just don't. And your next step, you need to create a game design document. So go check this video next, and wishlist my game. See ya!